and good morning-ish. Yeah, it's still morning. Welcome back to Reading Tolkien and the Silmarillion. We'll give it a few minutes to see who's going to pop in with us, and then we'll continue where we left off last week, which was just before shit got real, I think. Just before the elves, I think they had just landed in Middle-earth after Melkor betrayed everybody and stole the gems and created a mess of things. So we'll give it a few minutes, see who shows up, and we'll get started. Let's see here. Hello, Sagittarius. Welcome. Let's pull that out. So, a quick reminder of what happened last time. Let's see. So, Melkor, or Morgoth, destroyed the trees with the big spider monster. They stole the Silmarillions, and they killed Finwë, the king of the Noldor and the father of Fëanor. So he really messed things up for everybody. And Fëanor, being very upset by this, has declared vengeance. He's going to chase the ends of the earth for this guy and get back the Silmarils and avenge his father. And to that end, a lot of bad things have already happened. To escape the island, they ended up betraying another group of elves and killing them to steal their boats. Then they actually had issues within their own group where Fëanor didn't trust his half-brother Fingolfin and crossed the ocean without him, leaving him behind and burning the boats so that no one could use them to cross. Fingolfin, determined not to be left behind, takes his people across the frozen tundra above the islands, and a lot of people die on that really, really long, horrible pilgrimage. And I think that's about where we left off, was they had just finished crossing the ice and had finally made it over the sea. And now Fingolfin's group and Fëanor's group are in Middle-earth, but I believe they are still separated. They haven't reunited because obviously it took the ice group a lot longer to get over to Middle-earth. So that's where we stopped. I think we're actually going to jump back a little bit in time to discuss some other characters before they continue the story of what Fëanor and his gang are doing. Hello, Billy. Hello, Jeff. Sarah, thanks for joining us. If you'll remember, or way back, a couple chapters back, there was the story of the one elf king who found, who met the beautiful wizard lady, the Maiar, Melian, in the forest, and became so entranced he couldn't move, and they fell in love, and so they disappeared into Middle-earth, and nobody could ever find them, and they left Middle-earth without them. So this story is going to return to that character, Elwë, and Melian, his soon-to-be wife, presumably, and what they do after they've fallen in love and they run off to frolic in Middle-earth by themselves. We'll give it one more minute, and then I will start reading Chapter 10 of the Sindar, because once again, we are going to have another new group of elves. If you missed it last time, I put some cheat sheets in the description of the video. They're not in this one. I forgot to put them again. But you can check the last video, and it'll have some. All right, I'll go ahead and start reading Chapter 10 of the Sindar, which is a whole other new group of elves that are the descendants, or the clan, I guess, of Elwë and Melian. Now, as has been told, the power of Elwë and Melian increased in Middle-earth, and all the elves of Beleriand, from the mariners of Círdan to the wandering hunters of the Blue Mountains beyond the river Gelion, owed Elwë as their lord. Elu Thingol he was called, King Greymantle, in the tongue of his people. They are called the Sindar, the Grey Elves of starlit Beleriand, and although they were Morroquendi, under the lordship of Thingol and the teaching of Melian, they became the fairest and most wise and skillful of all the elves of Middle-earth. Alright, so Morroquendi. There are Calaquendi and Morroquendi elves. This is so much. That's basically a nice big term that means dark elf. And in Tolkien's world, the difference between light elves and dark elves is who went and lived on the island of the gods and who didn't. The Morroquendi are the dark elves, they never lived on the island. Calaquendi are the light elves that lived on the island. The Grey Elves are a kind of dark elf that are considered Twilight Elves because their king, Elwë, did go to the island. So they kind of learn a lot of things from him, but they themselves never saw the island. Anyway, a lot of fancy words for this is a new group of elves. Let's see here. At the end of the first age of the chaining of Melkor, when all the earth had peace and the glory of Valinor was at its noon, there came into the world Luthien, the only child of Thingol and Melian. Though Middle-earth lay for the most part in the sleep of Yavanna, in Beleriand under the power of Melian there was life and joy, and the bright stars shone as silver fires, and there in the forest of Neldoreth Luthien was born, and the white flowers of Nymphredel came forth to greet her as stars from the earth. It came to pass during the second age of the captivity of Melkor that dwarves came over the blue mountains of Ered Luin into Beleriand. Themselves they named Khazad, but the Sindar called them Naugrim, the stunted people, and Gonhirim, masters of stone. Far to the east were the most ancient dwellings of the Naugrim, but they had delved for themselves great halls and mansions, after the manner of their kind, in the eastern side of Ered Luin. And these cities were named in their own tongue, Gabilgathol and Tumunzahar. To the north of the great height of Mount Dolmed was Gabilgathoth, which the elves interpreted in their tongue, Belagost, that is Mickelberg. And southward was dwelled Tuhumzahar by the elves named Nogrod, the Hollowbold. Greatest of all the mansions of the dwarves was Khazad-dûm, the Dwero-dwelf, Hanhodrond in the Elvish tongue, that was afterwards in the days of its darkness called Moria. But it was far off in the mountains of mist, beyond the wide leagues of Iradior, and to the Eldar came but as a name and a rumor from the words of the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. So, the wizard lady and the elf got married, and they had a kid, and they're raising their own kind of clan in the land of Beleriand. And as they're doing that, new creatures come across the mountains. The dwarves show up for the first time, and this whole chapter just explains a lot of their ancient cities. This one's over here, and that one's over there. You probably recognize the name Moria because it comes up in The Lord of the Rings. It was originally a city, and it will fall many, many, many years later. From Nogrod and Belagost, the Naugrim came forth into Beleriand, and the elves were filled with amazement, for they had believed themselves to be the only living things in Middle-earth that spoke with words or wrought with hands, and that all others were but birds and beasts. But they could understand no word of the tongue of the Naugrim, which to their ears was cumbrous and unlovely, and few ever of the Eldar have achieved the mastery of it. But the dwarves were swift to learn, and indeed were more willing to learn the elven tongue than to teach their own to those of alien race. It'll become a thing later where the dwarven tongue is very protected by the dwarves. They don't share it often. So when elves do learn the language, it's considered very intimate, very special. Later there will be an elf that learns it named Celebrimbor, who becomes friends with a dwarf. Carvey, something, can't remember his name. And then I think Legolas also is taught some by Gimli, because obviously Gimli and Legolas have a very, very close relationship in The Lord of the Rings. Few of the Eldar went ever to Nogrod and Belagost, save Eol of Nan Elmoth and Maeglin his son. But the dwarves trafficked into Beleriand and made a great road that passed under the shoulders of Mount Dolmed, and followed the course of the river Askar, crossing Gelion at Sarnathrad, the Ford of Stones, where battle after befell. Ever cool was the friendship between the Naugrim and the Eldar, although much profit they had one of the other. But at the time those griefs that lay between them had not yet come to pass, and King Thingol welcomed them. But the Naugrim gave their friendship more readily to the Noldor in after days than to any of the other elves and men, because of their love and reverence for Eul, and the gems of the Noldor they praised above all other wealth. So Eul is the god of craftsmanship and the god that created the dwarves, so that's who they worship. That is their number one chief guy. And the Noldor have always liked him because they're craftsmen themselves. So their shared like of creating things, of fashioning gems and armor and swords and blah blah blah, and their appreciation for the same god means that dwarves tend to like the Noldor way more than anybody else. In the darkness of Arda already the dwarves wrought great works, for even from the first days of their fathers they had marvelous skill with metals and with stone. But in that ancient time iron and copper they loved to work rather than silver or gold. Now Melian had much foresight after the manner of the Maiar, and when the second age of the captivity of Melkor had passed, she counseled Thingol that the peace of Arda would not last forever. He took thought, therefore, how he should make for himself a kingly dwelling, and a place that should be strong if evil were to awake again in Middle-earth, and he sought aid in the council of the dwarves of Belegost. They gave it willingly, for they were unwearied in those days and eager for new works. And though the dwarves ever demanded a price for all they did, whether with delight or with toil, at this time they held themselves paid, for Melian taught them much they were eager to learn, and Thingol rewarded them with many fair pearls. These Círdan gave to him, for they were got in great number in the shallow waters about the Isle of Belar. But the Naugrim had not seen their like, and they held them dear. One there was as great as a dove's egg, and its sheen was as starlight on the foam of the sea. Nymphelos it was named, and the chieftain of the dwarves of Belegost prized it above a mountain of wealth. Hello, Cygnus. Hey, Alexis. Therefore the Naugrim labored long and gladly for Thingol, and devised for him mansions after the fashion of their people, delved deep in the earth, where the let me work this one out. Esgalduin, where the Esgalduin flowed down and parted Neldoreth from region, there rose in the midst of the forest a rocky hill, and the river ran at its feet. There they made the gates of the hall of Thingol, and they built a bridge of stone over the river, by which alone the gate could be entered. Beyond the gates, wide passages ran down to high halls and chambers far below that were hewn in the living stone, so many and so great that the dwelling was named Menegroth, the 1,000 Caves. But the elves also had part in that labor, and elves and dwarves together, each with their own skill, there wrought out the visions of Melian, images of the wonder and beauty of Valinor beyond the sea. The pillars of Menegroth were hewn in the likeness of the beaches of Arome, stock, bow, and leaf, and they were lit with lanterns of gold. The nightingales sang there as in the gardens of Lorien, and there were fountains of silver and basins of marble, and floors of many-colored stones. Carven figures of beasts and birds there ran upon the walls, or climbed upon the pillars, or peered among the branches entwined with many flowers. And as the years passed, Melian and her maidens filled the halls with woven hangings, wherein could be read the deeds of the Valar, and many things that had befallen in Arda since its beginning, and shadows of things that were yet to be. That was the fairest dwelling of any king that has ever been east of the sea. And when the building of Menegroth was achieved, and there was peace in the realm of Thingol and Melian, the Naugrim yet came again, ever and anon over the mountains, and went in traffic about the lands. But they went seldom to the Phalis, for they hated the sound of the sea and feared to look upon it. To Beleriand there came no other rumor or tiding of the world without. But as the third age of the captivity of Melkor drew, the dwarves became troubled, and they spoke to King Thingol, saying that the Valar had not rooted out utterly the evils of the north, and now the remnant, having long multiplied in the dark, were coming forth once more and roaming far and wide. There are fell beasts, they said, in the land east of the mountains, and your ancient kindred that dwell there are flying from the plains to the hills. And ere long the evil creatures came even to Beleriand, over passes in the mountains, or up from the south through the dark forests. Wolves there were, or creatures that walked in wolf shapes, and other fell beings of shadow, and among them were the orcs, who afterwards wrought ruin in Beleriand. But they were yet few and wary, and did but smell out the ways of the land, awaiting the return of their lord. Whence they came, or what they were, the elves knew not then, thinking them perhaps to be Avari, who had become evil and savage in the wild, in which they guessed all too near, it is said. So basically, It's been a while. The dwarves and the elves in Beleriand have been chilling, building their towns, building their cities. And suddenly the dwarves say, hey, we've been traveling a lot, and we've noticed there's a lot of evil, kind of weird monsters out there. You know, it's not great. And they're coming closer to us. And the monsters that are coming, some of them are orcs. The people of Middle-earth right now don't really know what orcs are. They guess that they are Avari. Avari being one of the first two split of elves, when all the elves used to be together and the gods came to take them to the island. Some of the elves panicked and ran. Those are the Avari, the ones that fled. They never even saw the gods, so they're kind of considered like wild creatures. So to them, they thought, oh, well, maybe the Avari have gone so native that they've turned into monsters. They're not entirely wrong. The orcs were originally elves, but it wasn't elves that just turned into this. Someone transformed them into this. They haven't figured that out yet. Therefore Thingol took thought for arms, which before his people had not needed, and these at first the Nalgrim smithied for him, for they were greatly skilled in such work, though none among them surpassed the craftsmen of Nogrod, of whom Telkar the smith was greatest in renown. A warlike race of old were all the Nalgrim, and they would fight fiercely against whomsoever aggrieved them, servants of Melkor or Eldar or Avari or wild beasts, or not seldom their own kin, dwarves of other manors and lordships. Their smithcraft indeed the Sindar soon learned of them, yet in the tempering of steel alone of all crafts, the dwarves were never outmatched even by the Noldor, and in the making of mail of linked rings, which was first contrived by the smiths of Belagost, their work had no rival. At this time, therefore, the Sindar were well armed, and they drove off all creatures of evil, and they had peace again. But Thingol's armories were stored with axes, and with spears and swords, and tall helms, and long coats of bright mail, for the hauberks of the dwarves were so fashioned that they rusted not, but shone ever as if they were new burnished. And that proved well for Thingol in the time that was to come. So all of this, we've jumped back into the past. This has all been happening since Thingol vanished from the world and was lost, and the other elves left. They left, I think maybe like 2,000 years or something have passed here, where the other group of elves all went back to Valinor, and they built their cities, and they had their families, and all that stuff we've already read. While that's been happening, over on the other side of the ocean, Thingol and Melian have built their kingdom, the dwarves have showed up, they've built their cities, so this is all kind of building together. Aren't orcs the elves that started messing with dark magic or something? So in the beginning, when Melkor first showed up and the elves had just been born, he started kidnapping elves, and he was the one that fucked with them and turned them into monsters. And that's why the Valar first came over the sea to fight him, because he was doing real shitty things with the elves. Later, I think, it becomes clearer that they are the descendants of tortured elves, that they have that similar root. But it's not something that, like, they did. It wasn't their own choice or dark magic. Melkor did it to them. Now, as has been told, one Lenwë of the host of Olwë forsook the march of the Eldar at the time when the Teleri were halted by the shores of the great river upon the borders of the westlands of Middle-earth. Alright, we'd stop again. So, up until this point, it's been the story of Elwë, who was renamed Thingol when he became king. He was one of the two kings of the Teleri, which are the wandering sea elves, the ones that like the ocean. He was one of the kings, and he fell in love with Melian in the forest and said, fuck this shit, I'm out, and just disappeared. And his people were like, where the fuck did our king went? And so once they kind of figured that he was gone, they had to abandon him. Some stayed behind to still look for him, some left. There was another person in the same clan of elves, the same elf ocean group, named Lenwë, who also was from that group, who also decided to leave and took some of his friends with him, and they stayed in Middle-earth and became a group called the Nandor. So this is we've now switched again to discussing another group of elves called the Nandor. I am going to step away for just a second because I think I hear my cat outside crying. I will be right back and we'll continue. Ugh. Kitty, where are you? So my mother had apparently been doing some things up around here and accidentally gone and locked Pippin in a bedroom. That's the sound I was hearing. I knew I heard something. All right. Little is known of the wanderings of the Nandor, whom he led away down Anduin. Some, it is said, dwelt age-long in the woods of the vale of the great river. Some came at last to its mouths, and there dwelt by the sea. And yet others, passing by arid Nimros, the White Mountains, came north again and entered the wilderness of Eriador between arid Luin and the far mountains of Mist. You'll notice a lot of places are called arid blah, arid bleh, arid. E-R-E-D means mountain. So arid Luin is a mountain. Arid Nimros is a mountain. You'll see that a lot. Now these were a woodland people and had no weapons of steel, and the coming of the fell beasts of the north filled them with great fear. And as the Nalgrim declared to King Thingol and Menegroth, therefore Denethor, son of Lenwë, hearing rumor of the might of Thingol and his majesty, and of the peace of his realm, gathered such host of his scattered people as he could, and led them over the mountains into Beleriand. There they were welcomed by Thingol as kin long lost that returned, and they dwelt in Osiriand, the land of 7 rivers. Of the long years of peace that followed after the coming of Denethor, there is little tale. In those days, it is said, Darin the minstrel, chief lore master of the kingdom of Thingol, devised his runes, and the Nalgrim that came to Thingol learned them, and were well pleased with the device, esteeming Darin's skill higher than did the Sindar, his own people. By the Nalgrim, the Cirth were taken east over the mountains and passed into the knowledge of many people, but they were little used by the Sindar for the keeping of records, until the days of the war, and much that was held in memory perished in the ruins of Doriath. Cirth is a style of writing. I can't remember. It's like runic language. It's the Dwarven runic language. So right now he's talking about how written word began to exist in the world of Middle-earth. But of bliss and glad life there is little to be said before it ends, as works fair and wonderful, while still they endure for eyes to see, are their own record, and only when they are in peril or broken forever do they pass into song. Hey, Akatsuki, this is chapter 10 of the Sindar. In Beleriand in those days, the elves walked, and the rivers flowed, and the stars shone, and the night flowers gave forth their scents, and the beauty of Melian was as the noon, and the beauty of Luthien was as the dawn and spring. In Beleriand, King Thingol upon his throne was as the lords of the Maiar, whose power is at rest, whose joy is as an air that they breathe in all their days, whose thought flows in a tide untroubled from the heights to the depths. In Beleriand still at times rode Orome the Great. Excuse me. Hello, Leon. Hello, Phil. In Beleriand still at times rode Orome the Great, passing like a wind over the mountains, and the sound of his horn came down the leagues of the starlight, and the elves feared him for the splendor of his countenance, and the great noise of the onrush of Nahar, his horse. But when the Valaroma echoed in the hills, they knew well that all evil things were fled away. But it came to pass, at last, that the end of bliss was at hand, and the noontide of Valinor was drawing to its twilight. For as has been told and is known to all, being written in lore and sung in many songs, Melkor slew the trees of the Valar with the aid of Ungoliant, and escaped, and came back to Middle-earth. Far to the north befell the strife of Morgoth and Ungoliant, but the great cry of Morgoth echoed through Beleriand, and all its people shrank for fear, for they knew not what it foreboded. They heard then the herald of death. Soon afterwards Ungoliant fled from the north and came into the realm of King Thingol, and a terror of darkness was about her. But by the power of Melian she was stayed, and entered not into Neldoreth, but abode long time under the shadow of the precipices in which Dothonian fell southward. And they became known as Ered Gogaroth, the Mountains of Terror, and none dared go thither or pass nigh them. There life and light were strangled, and all waters were poisoned. But Morgoth, as has been told, returned to Angband, one of his old fortresses, and built it anew, and above its doors he reared the reeking towers of Thangorodrim, and the gates of Morgoth were but 150 leagues distant from the bridge of Menegroth, far and all too near. Thangorodrim is a mountain range, so he has this old fortress from the first time they had war. He's gone back to the fortress, re-established it, raised these great mountains, and in fact, his kingdom is only a few leagues from the great elven kingdom of Menegroth. Now the orcs that multiplied in the darkness of the earth grew strong and fell, and their dark lord filled them with a lust of ruin and death. And they issued from Angban's gates under the dark clouds that Morgoth sent forth, and silently passed into the highlands of the north. Thence, on a sudden, that's a weird way to word that. Thence, on a sudden, a great army came into Beleriand and assailed King Thingol. Now in his wide realm many elves wandered free in the wild, or dwelt at peace in small kindreds far sundered. And only about Menegroth, in the midst of the land, and among the Falas, in the country of the mariners, were there numerous people. But the orcs came down upon either side of Menegroth, and from camps in the east between Selen and Gelion, and west in the plains between Sirion and Narog, they plundered far and wide. I believe those are all rivers, because it's the kingdom of 7 rivers. I think those are all rivers that connect. And Thingol was cut off from Círdan at Elgarest. Círdan being the guy that's in charge of all the elves with the boats down in the south. Therefore he called upon Denethor. That's the guy that leads the Nandor, the wood elves. So there's wood elves, sea elves, elves in the cave. Therefore he called upon Denethor, and the elves came in force from region beyond Eros and from Osiriand, and fought the first battle in the wars of Beleriand. And the eastern host of the orcs was taken between the armies of the Eldar, north of the Andram, and midway between Eros and Gelion, and there they were utterly defeated. And those that fled north from the great slaughter were waylaid by the axes of the Naugrim that issued from Mount Dolmed. Few indeed returned to Angband. But the victory of the elves was dear bought, for those of Osiriand were light-armed and no match for the orcs, who wore shod with iron, and were iron-shielded, and bore great spears with broad blades. And Denethor was cut off and surrounded upon the hill of Emon Ereb. There he fell, and all his nearest kin about him, before the host of Thingol could come to his aid. Bitterly, though his fall was avenged, when Thingol came upon the rear of the orcs and slew them in heaps, his people lamented him ever after, and took no king again. After the battle, some people returned to Osiriand, and their tidings filled the remnant of their people with great fear, so that thereafter they came never forth in open war, but kept themselves by wariness and secrecy, and they were called the Laquendi, the green elves, because of the raiment of the color of leaves. So I think we now have our, 13th group of elves. So what's happened here is he's returned, he built his fortress, and he said, alright, I've got all these badass orcs, let's go kill some elves. And because the elves have basically been living in peace for so long, they weren't entirely prepared for this. Menegroth, the cave kingdom, the king of the cave kingdom, Thingol, was a little more prepared. He calls upon some of his friends, and they all get together and fight them off, but a lot of people die. And the one group of elves, the Laquendi, decide it was so horrible they're just going to retreat and hide, and they're never going to fight a war again. Many went north and entered the guarded realm of Thingol, and were merged with his people. And when Thingol came again to Menegroth, he learned that the orc host in the west was victorious, and had driven Círdan to the rim of the sea. Therefore he withdrew all his people that his summons could reach within the fastness of Neldoreth and region, and Melian put forth her power, and fenced all that dominion round about with this unseen wall of shadow and bewilderment, the girdle of Melian, that none thereafter could pass against her will or the will of King Thingol, unless one should come with a power greater than that of Melian the Maya. And this inner land, which was long named Eglador, was after called Doriath, the guarded kingdom, land of the girdle. Within it there was a watchful peace, but without there was peril and great fear, and the servants of Morgoth roamed at will, save in the walled havens of the Falas. So the war was so terrible, and they were so basically unprepared, that the sea elves were pushed way towards the sea down to the south. the forest elves decided to fuck off into the forest and hide forever, and the cave elves cast a spell to keep everything and everyone out and hid within their caves. So the orcs have free reign of the country, and the elves have all these, like, little hidden hideaways that they're staying in. New tidings were at hand, which none in Middle-earth had foreseen, neither Morgoth in his pits, nor Melian in Menegroth, for no news came out of Aman, whether by messenger or by spirit, or by vision and dream, after the death of the trees. In this same time, Fëanor came over the sea in the white ships of the Teleri, and landed in the Firth of Drengist, and there burned the ships at Losgar. So now the two timelines have caught up. This is all the stuff that happened before in the time when Fëanor and his gang were hanging out on their island. This is what was happening in Middle-earth. Now the two timelines have intersected. Yeah, most people don't know about the fact that there were elves that lived in caves, mostly because this big cave kingdom is going to fall, rather tragically, and it's not going to be reestablished. This is really the first time in history that the elves and the dwarves are going to get along. That's going to change later, and so the dwarves are never going to help them build a cave kingdom again, because the dwarves helped them build Menegroth. Alright. Chapter 11. Of the Sun and Moon and the Hiding of Valinor. It is told that after the flight of Melkor, the Valar sat long unmoved upon their thrones in the Ring of Doom. But they were not idle, as Fëanor declared in the folly of his heart. For the Valar may work many things with thought rather than with hands, and without voices in silence they may hold counsel with one another. Thus they held vigil in the night of Valinor, and their thought passed back beyond Ea and forth to the end. Yet neither power nor wisdom assuaged their grief, and the knowing of evil in the hour of its being. And they mourned not more for the death of the trees than for the marring of Fëanor, of the works of Melkor, one of the most evil. For Fëanor was made the mightiest in all parts of body and mind, in valor, in endurance, in beauty, in understanding, in skill, in strength, and in subtlety alike, of all the children of Ilúvatar, and a bright flame was within him. The works of wonder for the glory of Arda that he might otherwise have wrought, only Manwë might in some measure conceive. And it was told by the Vanyar, who held vigil with the Valar, that when the messengers declared to Manwë the answer of Fëanor to his heralds, Manwë wept and bowed his head. But at the last word of Fëanor, that at the least the Noldor should do deeds to live in song forever, he raised his head as one that hears a voice far off, and said, "So shall it be. Dear bought these songs shall be accounted, and yet shall be well bought, for the price could be no other. Thus even as Eru spoke to us shall beauty not before conceived be brought into Ea, and yet evil yet be good to have been." But Mandos said, "And yet remain evil. To me shall Fëanor come soon." So after what happened with the trees and Fëanor running off to be angry and get his revenge, the gods sat in a circle and kind of spoke to one another in secret, trying to figure out what's going on, what they should do. And realizing they couldn't change Fëanor's mind about leaving, they are, basically saying, this is such a tragedy, we know this is going to end badly, but we can't stop it. They're very offhand gods. Like, I guess from a viewpoint of a person like Tolkien and in general us, like, gods don't interfere in our daily lives, so why would gods interfere with these characters' daily lives? But when you look at it and say, but they're there. Like, they're literally, they could just cross the ocean and fight Melkor and change everything, but they don't really take on an active role like that. There's just something about them that they must be passive. The humans, the mortals, the children of Ilúvatar are allowed to take action and do things, but they can't. And if you look at it like that, it makes a lot more sense. Either they can't change things, or they don't care enough to, which I don't think is quite true, because clearly Manwë is very upset here. I could see some of the other gods not caring, but Manwë, I think, does care about the children and wants to change things, but they are not going to intervene to stop Fëanor from charging forward to a terrible fate. When at last the Valar learned that the Noldor had indeed passed out of Aman and were come to Middle-earth, they arose and began to set forth in deeds those counsels which they had taken in thought for the redress of the evils of Melkor. Then Manwe bade Yavanna and Nenya to put forth all the powers of growth and healing, and put forth all their powers upon the trees. But the tears of Nenya availed not to heal their mortal wounds, and for a long while Yavanna sang alone in the shadows. Yet even as hope failed and her song faltered, Telperion bore at last upon a leafless bough one great flower of silver, and Laurelin a single fruit of gold. These Yavanna took, and then the trees died, and their lifeless stems stand yet in Valinor, a memorial of vanished joy. But the flower and the fruit Yavanna gave to Eul, and Manwe hollowed them, and Eul and his people made vessels to hold them and preserve their radiance, as is said in the Silmarillion, the Song of the Sun and Moon. These vessels the Valar gave to Varda, that they might become lamps of heaven, outshining the ancient stars, being nearer to Arda, and she gave them power to traverse the lower regions of Ilmen and set them in voyage upon appointed courses above the girdle of the earth, from the west unto the east, and to return. So this is the creation of the sun and moon. They are kind of in lore treated like boats that travel through the sky and through the sea of heaven, and they are created from the last pieces of light of the two fancy trees. These things the Valar did, recalling in their twilight the darkness of the lands of Arda, and they resolved now to illume Middle-earth, and with light to hinder the deeds of Melkor. For they remembered the Avari that remained by the waters of their awakening, and they did not utterly forsake the Noldor in exile, and Manwe knew also that the hour of the coming of men was drawing nigh. And it is said indeed that even as the Valar made war upon Melkor for the sake of the Quendi, so now for the time they forbore for the sake of the Hildor, the aftercomers, the younger children of Iluvatar. For so grievous had been the hurts of Middle-earth in the war upon Utumno, that the Valar feared less even worse should now befall, whereas the Hildor should be mortal and weaker than the Quendi to withstand fear and tumult. Moreover, it was not revealed to Manwe when the beginning of men should be, or where the beginning of men should be, north, south, or east. Therefore the Valar set forth light, but made strong the land of their dwelling. Isel the Sheen, the Vanyar of old named the Moon, flower of Telperion and Valinor, and Anar the fire-golden fruit of Laurelin they named the sun. But the Noldor named them also Reyna, the wayward, and Vasa, the heart of fire, that awakens and consumes. For the sun was set as a sign for the awakening of men and the waning of the elves, but the moon cherishes their memory. The maiden, whom the Valar chose from among the Maiar to guide the vessel of the sun, was named Arion, and he that steered the island of the moon was Tilion. In the days of the trees, Arion had tended the golden flowers in the gardens of Vanna, and watered them with the bright dews of Laurelin. But Tilion was a hunter of the company of Arome, and had a silver bow. He was a lover of silver, and when he would rest, he forsook the woods of Arome, and going into Lorien, he lay in dreams by the pools of Este, in Telperion's flickering beams. And he begged to be given the task of tending forever that last flower of silver. Arion the maiden was mightier than he, and she was chosen because she had not feared the heats of Laurelin, and was unhurt by them, being from the beginning a spirit of fire, whom Melkor had not deceived, nor drawn to his service. Too bright were the eyes of Arion for even the Eldar to look on, and leaving Valinor, she forsook the form and raiment which, like the Valar, she had worn there, and she was as naked flame, terrible in the fullness of her splendor. I love Arion. The image of this powerful female fire spirit, so great that no one can look upon her, and so terrible that the orcs can't even walk in the light of her because they will burn and die. She's a great, great figure. And part of the reason why the Valar have created the sun and moon is because it will hinder the orcs and the evil forces, because from now on we'll see the sun hurts them and makes it harder for them to travel. So they've done something, I guess. They're not just sitting on their hands. Isil was first wrought and made ready, and first rose into the realm of the stars, and was the elder of the new lights, as was Telperion of the trees. For a while the moon had moonlight. The world had moonlight. The moon had moonlight. For a while the world had moonlight, and many things stirred and woke that had waited long in the sleep of Yavanna. Remember, in the very beginning of the world, Yavanna put a lot of things to sleep so they would wait until the world was more peaceful to be alive. The servants of Morgoth were filled with amazement, but the elves of the outer lands looked up in delight. And even as the moon rose above the darkness in the west, Fingolfin let blow his silver trumpets and began his march into Middle-earth, and the shadows of his host went long and black before them. Tilion had traversed the heavens 7 times, and thus was in the furthest east when the vessel of Arion was made ready. Then Anar rose in glory, and the first dawn of the sun was like a great fire upon the towers of the Pelori. The clouds of Middle-earth were kindled, and there was heard the sound of many waterfalls. Then indeed Morgoth was dismayed, and he descended into the uttermost depths of Angband, and withdrew his servants, sending forth great reek and dark cloud to hide his land from the light of the day star. Now Varda purposed that the 2 vessels should journey in Ilmen and ever be aloft, but not together. Each should pass from Valinor into the east and return, and one issuing from the west as the other turned from the east. Thus the first of the new days were reckoned after the manner of the trees, from the mingling of the lights when Arion and Tilion passed in their courses, above the middle of the earth. But Tilion was wayward and uncertain in speed, and held not to his appointed path, and he sought to come near to Arion, being drawn by her splendor, though the flame of Anar scorched him, and the island of the moon was darkened. Explaining the phases of the moon. Because of the waywardness of Tilion, therefore, and yet more because of the prayers of Lorien and Este, who said that sleep and rest had been banished from the earth and the stars were hidden, Varda changed her counsel, and allowed a time wherein the world should still have shadow and half light. Anar rested therefore a while in Valinor, lying upon the cool bosom of the outer sea, and evening, the time of the descent and resting of the moon, was the hour of greatest light and joy in Aman. But soon the sun was drawn down by the servants of Ulmo, and went in haste under the earth, and so came unseen to the east, and there mounted the heaven again, lest night be overlong and evil walk under the moon. But by Anar the waters of the outer sea were made hot, and glowed with color fire. And Valinor had light for a while after the passing of Arion. Yet as she journeyed under the earth and drew towards the east, the glow faded, and Valinor was dim, and the Valar mourned the most for the death of Lorelin. At dawn the shadows of the mountains of defense lay heavy on the blessed realm. Varda commanded the moon to journey in like manner, and passing under the earth to arise in the east, but only after the sun had descended from the heaven. But Tilion went with uncertain pace as yet he goes, and was still drawn towards Arion as he shall ever be, so that often both may be seen above the earth together, or at times it will chance that he comes so nigh that his shadow cuts off her brightness, and there is a darkness amid the day. Therefore, by the coming and going of Anar, the Valar reckoned the days thereafter until the change of the world. For Tilion tarried seldom in Valinor, but more often would pass swiftly over the western land, over Avanthar, or Araman or Valinor, and plunge into the chasm beyond the outer sea, pursuing his way alone amid the grots and caverns at the roots of Arda. There he would often wander long, and late would return. Still thereafter the long night, the light of Valinor was greater and fairer than upon Middle-earth, for the sun rested there, and the lights of heaven drew nearer to earth in that region. But neither the sun nor the moon could recall the light that was of old, that came from the trees before they were touched by the poison of Ungoliant. That light lives now in the Silmarils alone. But Morgoth hated the new lights, and was for a while confounded by this unlooked-for stroke of the Valar. Then he assailed Tilion, sending spirits of shadow against him, and there was strife in Ilmen beneath the path of the stars. But Tilion was victorious, and Arion Morgoth feared with a great fear, but dared not come nigh her, having indeed no longer the power. For as he grew in malice, and sent forth from himself the evil that he conceived in lies and creatures of wickedness, his might passed into them and was dispersed, and he became evermore bound to the earth, unwilling to issue from his dark strongholds. With shadows he hid himself and his servants from Arion, the glance of whose eyes he could not long endure, and the lands near his dwelling were shadowed in fumes and great clouds. It's very interesting to me how, obviously this is a story and a book series that he started writing in, the 1920s. And being a well-off man of that time had certain certain societal things instilled in him, as we all do, and as we all must overcome. It's so interesting to me the way that he writes women, and how different I think it is from a lot of other stories of the time. His stories definitely have far more men than women, I think, and they are definitely somewhat typical in that women are healers and women are lovers and men are warriors and men are blah blah blah. But so many of his most powerful and radiant characters are women. The two figures that Melkor fears the most are Varda, the goddess of the stars, and Arian, the goddess of the sun. You know, and later Galadriel will be the most powerful and ancient ancient figure, period, in Middle-earth, the most powerful figure. Ungoliant is this great, terrible female monstrosity. It's very interesting that he tends to, when there are great warriors, when there are ones that stand out amongst all, it's a woman. It's very interesting that there aren't a lot of female warriors or female standouts, but when they stand out, when they are the greatest, they really stand out. It's interesting how he writes women and doesn't really see them as general figures in day-to-day life, but when they are great, they are greater than anyone. Kind of like Éowyn later, when she becomes the warrior that kills the king of the Nazgul. Just something that's always intrigued me about the way he writes. Seeing the assault upon Tilion, the Valar were in doubt, fearing what the malice and cunning of Morgoth might yet contrive against them. Being unwilling to make war upon Middle-earth, they remembered nonetheless the ruin of Ulmarinn, and they resolved that the like should not befall Valinor. Therefore, at the time, they fortified their land anew, and they raised up the mountain walls of the Pelori to sheer and dreadful heights, east, north, and south. Their outer sides were dark and smooth, without foothold or ledge, and they fell in great precipices, with faces hard as glass, and rose up to towers with crowns of white ice. A sleepless watch was set upon them, and no pass led through them, save only at the Calasira. But that pass the Valar did not close, because of the Eldar that were faithful. And in the city of the Tirion, upon the green hill, Finarfin yet ruled the remnant of the Noldor in the deep cleft of the mountains. For all those of elven race, even the Vanyar and Ingwe their lord, must breathe at times the outer air and the wind that comes over the sea from the lands of their birth, and the Valar would not sunder the Teleri wholly from their kin. But in the Calasirsa they set strong towers and many sentinels, and at its issue upon the plains of Valmar a host was encamped, so that neither bird nor beast nor elf nor man nor any creature beside that dwelt in Middle-earth could pass that leaguer. And in that time also, which songs called Nurtale Valinor Reva, the hiding of Valinor, the enchanted isles were set, and all the seas about them were filled with shadows and bewilderment. And those isles were strung to a net in the shadowy seas from the north to the south, before Tolaressia, the lonely isle, is reached by one sailing west. Hardly might any vessel pass between them, for in dangerous sounds the waves sighed forever upon dark rocks shrouded in mist. And in the twilight a great weariness came upon mariners and a loathing of the sea, but all that ever set foot upon the islands were there entrapped, and slept until the change of the world. Thus it was as Mandos foretold them in Ahriman the blessed realm was shut against the Noldor, and of the many messengers that in after days sailed into the west, none ever came to Valinor save one only, the mightiest Marinor in song. So that brings us to the end of the Sun and Moon. We now have multiple groups of mortals children in Middle-earth. The dwarves have awakened. Fëanor's group is over there. Fingolfin's coming. The cave elves are there. A lot of stuff is now set up to go down, and the next chapter is of the coming of men, which we will not read today because I'm going to cut it short today since we're reading a lot later with the House and Fata Morgana, and I don't want to challenge my voice too much. Thank you for joining me. We will continue tomorrow with another short reading. Until Fata Morgana's done, I probably won't read it too long because my voice hates me. It hates me. It's raspy a little bit right now, but it'll be fine. Thanks for joining me. I will play Fata Morgana in a little while. Let my voice rest a bit and play it as soon as I've got some work done. So probably a couple hours. And yeah, I think that's it. Thanks for joining me. Become a member to support the channel if you can. Check the links below in the description for social media, all kinds of stuff. And I'll see you guys in a couple hours.